time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. It is episode 27. I'm Rob Bence, and with me every week is Rob Dix. Hello, Rob. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you, Rob. And this week we are going to be talking about Rich Dad, Poor Dad. We've talked about it before, but this time we're going to go into this great book in even more detail and give you our thoughts about how it relates to property. We're also going to be reporting on suspicious mattress stains in our news story. And our resource of the week, we've got two really great podcast-specific resources for you this week. So lots to pack in.
Yeah, really good episode. Rich Dad, Poor Dad is the daddy of property investment books, even though it hardly talks about property investments at all. But we will come to that. But before we do, we like to start every week with the fine, upstanding people who leave us reviews. And this week, we have the reviews from the following people. First up from Richard Lewins. Richard says, a must for beginners. I've been downloading Property Geek last year. I'm very pleased the two Robs have teamed up to help newbies like me. I spoke with Rob Bence from RMP who told me about the new podcast. It's not that new now, Richard, so I appreciate you've been listening for a while, and I know you've been speaking with me at RMP as well. So thank you very much for your review. Much appreciated. Tom says, my first review ever. This is my first review I've ever written for iTunes, but felt the need to just say how I found this podcast. I agree with all the other reviews that the content is extremely useful to a newbie like me. But the thing I like most about the podcast is how Rob and Rob make property investments achievable for anyone. If you have to listen to one episode, I would recommend episode 15 on goal setting. So useful even if you aren't interested in property. Thank you, Tom, and I think you'll enjoy episode 25, which is a property dreamline, which is related to that. So episode 15 and 25. And finally, Noah says, informative and entertaining. This is the only podcast on property worth listening to. Well, I beg to differ, Noah. There's two others. Rob and Rob cut out the unnecessary jargon and dispense their key learnings in an unbiased manner. Well, thank you, Noah, Tom, and Richard. Very much appreciated.
Thank you so much. And I've had a few people recently saying that they've only just discovered this podcast exists. They found us through one of either your own podcast or my own podcast, and they've just discovered it. So those people are going to have a lot of back episodes to get through. But thank you to however you found us. Thank you so much for the review. And we've also had a few people saying that it's the first time they've ever reviewed anything on iTunes. So we doubly appreciate you making the effort to tell us what you think.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so Rob, I know you've had another very busy week this week. What have you been up to?
Yeah, really busy week. Lots and lots going on. First of all, the app is really coming on. So the Property Investment app, if you've not been following the show, I'm building an app called the Property Investment app. Just like the Property Podcast, took a long time to think of the title. The app is in the process of being built, but if you're interested in following the progress and even contributing to what the end product looks like, go to propertyinvestmentapp.com. Just register your details there and you can follow along with what's happening, and I will promise to give you the app for free. I won't say too much now because you can find out more, but go along to that. Also, I've had, interesting, Rob, we had a property launch a while ago, and when clients come through RMP, what we do before we get to the real properties is we do an example and look at a past investment. And one of my clients took it to a new level. So, hi, Matt Earl. Matt not only did his research, but he was actually flying over to the continent and took a photo of the development from overhead in the plane. So he actually sent me the photo. It's a bit blurry and I'll put it in the show notes, but absolutely brilliant. I normally only do 50 points in our due diligence pack, but I think we might have found a 51st overhead aerial shot. Thank you, Matt, for being the first person to go to those lengths when it comes to research. So very impressed with that. And finally, Rob, RMP is expanding. We are looking to take people on towards the end of the year. Now, it's a couple of months away, but I thought I'd mention it now because it's a fantastic opportunity. It's a chance to work in the business right alongside myself and really just take all my knowledge, however long that takes. I don't know. It could be 5 minutes or years. I'm not sure. But work along directly with me. There's a few opportunities. There's not just for one person. I'll be taking 2 or 3 people on in the next group of recruitment drive. And it's really to work in property investment on a day-to-day basis and really exciting. I mean, I clearly love it. So if anyone's interested or you think you know anybody who'd be interested, go to rmpproperty.com/property investment jobs. So that's rmpproperty.com/property investment jobs. There'll be more info there. I'll talk about it in the weeks to come because we've only just decided to do this, but Really looking for amazing people. So if you're amazing or you know anybody who's amazing, then please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
What a great opportunity. I've had a few emails from people recently actually saying, I really want to get into property investment, but it's really early. Should I be getting a job in property to learn? Should I become an estate agent to learn the business or something? So, I mean, that's the perfect opportunity right there.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it because, I wish this opportunity was available for me when I started, because I sort of worked my way through and then eventually got into investment. You don't have to work in investment already. You just have to have a willingness to learn, be very keen. And as I say, most importantly, be amazing.
Okay, well, amazing people, you know what to do. Well, I've been doing yet another podcast this week. My wife and I were interviewed on a podcast called The Work Talk Show. I don't know if that's one you listen to, Rob, but if not, you should do. It's by some guys called DJ Waldo and Nick Westergaard. They've had some really great guests on there in the past. And the whole show is about how work gets done today and all the different ways that people find in a world where you can work with more flexibility than ever before, all the different ways that people make use of that and do interesting things. And they wanted to talk to us because we obviously run our business from all over the world and have some kind of bizarre side projects on the go. So they wanted to dig into that. So that was a really, really fun interview, which should be going up in a couple of weeks, and I'll link to it in the show notes, and I'll be tweeting about it, of course, when that does happen.
I feel like you've been unfaithful to me, Rob. I feel a bit hurt.
I'm sure you'll be on next week. We tend to follow each other around these things.
Who is this wife?
We should also say a thank you to moneystepper.com, who featured us. In fact, they had a roundup of personal finance podcasts. As in a subsection of that, they had personal finance podcasts about property investment. 3 podcasts featured. We've got all 3 of them. So this is not an inside job. No money has changed hands, but they featured the Property Podcast, the UK Property Geek Podcast, and Property News Radio. So thank you so much to moneystepper.com. We'll have to link to that as well.
Thank you, Money Stepper. We do appreciate it. Okay, so news this week. I normally dig out the news story, so if this doesn't really sit with what we normally go through, you can blame Rob because he came up with this one, but it was so good that we just had to include it. So the story is, student fake tan stains costs landlord thousands.
Love how I've taken us even more down market. This story is from the Daily Mail, a fine news source, and apparently this landlord houses 400 students, and of those, 147 mattresses he had to throw out because they were stained with fake tan. So I don't know what to make of that, except Cardiff must be glowing. I don't know what else to say about it. I had no idea that there'd be that high a proportion, but I suppose you've got to keep an eye on your costs, and you never quite know where those costs are going to come from.
Right, Rob, I don't think there's much I can add to that story. It's a bit of a crazy one. You can have a look at the link in the show notes, which of course is thepropertypodcast.com/27. Have a look for yourself. But I think it's a good one you can check out in your own time. But let's move on to the topic of the week. What have we got, Rob?
We're going to be talking about a book that we've talked about before, and I think the reason we should revisit it again is that at the meetup a couple of weeks ago, I got to talking with a couple of people about books that have inspired us, and one guy actually said that he's gone through and he's read or downloaded every book that we've ever recommended in our resource of the week, so thank you to him, that's amazing. But a few people said that Rich Dad, Poor Dad was a book that's made a really big impact on them. It really says something because it's something that I've heard from property investors a lot who've been in the game for a while. They say that this was the breakthrough for them. But even now, people who are just getting into property now are still being inspired by Rich Dad, Poor Dad. But the book doesn't say much about property. Everyone kind of extrapolates from it and it kind of has a property awakening. But there's very, very little about property actually in there. So we're going to try and remedy that, talk about the book and talk about what property lessons you can extract from it. But first, Rob, I think you should kind of give people who haven't read the book yet an overview of what it is.
Okay, so Rich Dad, Poor Dad, as we say, is a book. It's a book on wealth creation and also wealth mindset. Okay, it's told in a story of a young boy who we believe is the author. Whether the story is strictly true or not, we're not sure. But the author tells the story of his childhood and how his father was his poor dad and his friend's dad was his rich dad. So he had a rich dad and a poor dad. And the lessons he learned from both. So how one went through life doing the things that, was told he should do, work for a good job, save money, put money away for the future, and things will be all right. And the other dad who was save your money to invest, make your money work harder for you, get passive income streams. Don't worry, we're not going to read the book out today. We're just going to cover the core principles that relate to property. But what I would say, if you have not read this book, and I think the majority of the listeners have. But if you haven't, if you're one of the people listening to this and you've not read this book, go and download it, go and buy it, go and get the audiobook. Nearly everyone I've spoken to who's read this book has said it's changed their life, okay, in terms of their approach to money and wealth creation. The book has such a big impact on the people who read it. It's incredible. This book, more than any other, and I know Rob's an author, but I'm sure you'll agree, has had more impact on property investors. And it's incredible, as Rob said, that it relates very little to property investment itself. So what we're going to do is take out the lessons from the book that we feel you can directly apply to property investments. And the first one, Rob, is the rat race.
So this one is kind of more of a general way of looking at things and a reason to be in property in the first place. And the quote from this, from Robert Kiyosaki, the author, is he has rich dads say, "The poor and the middle class work for money, and the rich have money work for them." And it's a really simple thing. And his conception of the rat race is that people have a job and every so often they'll get a pay rise, or maybe they'll move to a new job and get more money. And every time they do that, they'll increase their spending. So they're spending pretty much the same as they're earning. Every time they get more money, they'll just buy a new car or take on a gym subscription or something, and that pay rise will get wiped out. By contrast, the rich save money and use it to buy assets. And an asset is something that generates an income for you, whether you're working or not. It does it without your direct involvement. You'll still need to do something to maintain it, but it's not like you're having to show up somewhere between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock in order to get paid. When you think about it like that, it is incredibly simple. The only difference between the way rich people do things and the way everything else does things is when rich people earn money, they don't spend all of it, and whatever is left, they put it to work for them to earn money in the form of an asset. So this is the way that Rich Dad talks about getting out of the rat race. It's about building up assets. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to quit your job. The great thing about property is that once you've acquired it, you can set it up so it runs largely without your involvement. So you can have it running on the side as an extra income stream while you're still doing your job. A lot of people have got the ambition of using property to quit their job and so they can just go and do something else. But you don't have to. If you like your job or you want that security, there's no reason why you can't just have a property investment on the side. If you're lucky enough to be as fascinated with it as we are, it's a hobby that makes you a load of money and it's really fun. Property investment can be whatever you want it to be, but the core of the matter is not spending everything you earn and using that extra money and putting it to good use.
So one of the big talking points of the book is that Robert Kiyosaki says your home isn't an asset. So the property that you own, that you live in, is not an asset. First of all, before I go into that, let me quickly say what an asset is and what an asset isn't. An asset is something that pays you money, something that you own that gives you a return, as Rob's already said. A liability is something that costs you money. So a car is a liability. Your car costs you money each month. The petrol, the tax, the wear and tear, the depreciation, that's a liability. A buy-to-let is an asset if the rent is more than your costs. But your home you live in is not an asset. Now, for some people, this might be difficult to get your head round. And believe you me, if you go to a dinner party and you start telling everyone that the homes they live in are not assets, you're probably going to kill the mood. It's a bit controversial, and it takes a while for people to get their head around it. But once you've read the book, it'll become a lot clearer. What I would say is think about it this way. When you buy a property, yes, it may go up in value. However, you've got to pay the mortgage. No one else is paying that for you. When there's wear and tear in the property, no one else is paying you when you're in the property. The property may need upgrading because you want more space. That costs you money. No one is giving you any of this money. So that's a liability. The definition really of a property that you live in is a liability because it's taking money from you all the time. Whereas a buy-to-let gives you money. Now, I can already hear people screaming in the distance who are listening to this podcast going, well, my property's gone up in value. And yes, it has. But what happens if it doesn't? What happens if it sits flat for the next 5 years and your property will cost you for the next 5 years? It's been far from an asset if that happens. Now, hopefully the market will continue to rise, and over time it generally does. But there's no guarantee. So if there's no guarantee, then your home is never considered an asset. It can only be considered a liability. A tough one to take, but it's just one to consider. Now, there's nothing wrong with owning your own home. Let me also say that, because we all need a place to live. But plowing all your money into a huge house isn't building an asset either, because it's costing you money each month. So having your own home, a place where you can say this is yours, some security, a place to, feel safe and secure is fine. But don't be fooled into thinking it's an asset. Some people's retirement strategy is to sell their bigger home and downsize when they're older. That, for me, is not an efficient strategy. It's also a risky one because you don't know what the market's going to be doing when you come to sell. So that's quite a controversial one, but really important to understand.
Okay, so the next point is about debt. And in Rich Dad Poor Dad, is that debt doesn't have to be a dirty word. Debt is only bad if you use that debt to buy liabilities instead of buying assets. The classic example of using it to buy liabilities is taking out a loan to buy a car. So you take on debt, you buy a car, and then that car goes on to cost you money every month with depreciation, petrol, repairs, everything else. So not only have you got the interest payment on this loan, you've got costing you more money with all the liabilities that come along with the thing that you've bought. However, if you use debt to buy assets, that's totally different because you're using someone else's money, you're using the bank's money to buy something which is going to make you money. You've taken account of the interest payments and everything else, and you've realised that it's going to put money in your pocket at the end of every month. This really is just another way of talking about leverage. And we don't have to go into this too much because we talked about leverage back in episode number 18, where we talk about all the different factors to take into consideration with that. But essentially, to get into property investment, it involves overcoming this whole thing that you might have grown up with, that debt is bad. And a lot of people sort of want to pay down their mortgage as quickly as possible, or they don't want to take on a bigger mortgage in the first place. But if it's a buy-to-let, then you're basically running a business and you're using debt to finance that business in the same way that all companies do. So you just kind of have to overcome that programming around debt and realise that as long as you're using it to buy assets, that's all good.
Another mindset shift is pay yourself first. So most people live month to month like this. They get paid, they pay their bills, they enjoy their lifestyle, and if there's any money left at the end of the month, they might put that in a savings account. But often most people will just spend everything they earn, even when they get pay rises, something we've said already. So that's how the majority of people live their lives. But I know, fine listener, you're different. You pay yourself first. And you see your money that you put away for investment as a bill itself. So at the beginning of the month, you shift an allocated amount of money, whether it's a standing order or whether you just manually move the money yourself, and you say, okay, at the beginning of this month, I'm going to move £1,000. And I'm going to move that £1,000. Then I'm going to pay all my taxes, my bills, what have you. And then whatever's left, I'll live off. Okay, I can't go for a fine meal this month. I can only go to McDonald's. Well, that's fine because you've decided that your financial future is more important than a short-term gratification. It's a different way of thinking about things. But if you're not doing this already and you want to start investing in property, but you need to build a fund up, but you're not finding any money at the end of every month, then start paying yourself at the beginning of the month and find yourself cutting back on the things later in the month that you don't necessarily need, like eating out and so on. It's not to say that you should kill your life off completely, but it is to say that you need to do something dramatic, a big shift in your mindset if you want to start investing, if you're finding it difficult to save at the moment. A great point from Robert Kiyosaki and Rich Dad Poor Dad. One to take on board if you're not doing already.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really huge one. This made a big difference for me, actually. When I got my first ever job, my first ever full-time job, I was earning £15,000 a year, which is, in London, nothing. But still, I just took a few £100s and I had a direct debit going out to pay that into a savings account on the second day of each month. I never even saw it. By the time I checked my online banking, it had gone. And I knew that for the rest of the month, I had to make do with what was left. Had I not done that, there's no way I would have saved up that money. And it's amazing how quickly that money accumulates as well. But otherwise, I just never would have done it because it would have got spent so easily. And when you have to kind of make do with a little bit less, you always find ways of doing it. So I found that one made a really, really big difference. And it's probably the smallest, easiest thing that you can do that might just make a really huge impact. The next thing that he talks about in the book is overcoming obstacles. Obstacles are basically anything that prevent you from taking action. Because knowledge is all well and good and desire is all well and good, but without action, is pointless because you're going to be in exactly the same position you always were. And a big obstacle for a lot of people is fear, because people are scared of losing. They're scared of doing something that doesn't work out. They're scared of taking a risk and it doesn't pay off. And in the book, Kiyosaki says that winning means being unafraid to lose. And most people are so afraid of losing, they lose anyway because they haven't actually taken any action. To overcome fear, he suggests that the best way of doing that is through education. It's through kind of learning all about what you want to do and educating yourself about the risks and being in a good position to then take action. And by taking action, that diminishes the fear as well, even if it's only taking a small step every day. Another thing that I think really helps with this is taking a long-term view, because we've said before that if you look at property as a long-term thing, there'll be good times and there'll be bad times. But as long as you don't think of that you're going to have to make it work in the next year or something, it's much easier to kind of get over that fear and go, okay, well, whatever I do now, it's going to pay off in the long run. He also talks about cynicism as an obstacle. And this is something that we've talked about before with relation to the media. The media now seem to be talking up the housing market, and it's full of stories about price rises and mortgages being more available than ever and everything else. But until a few months ago, there was all kinds of stuff in the media about house price crashes and repossessions and all kinds of stuff. It's all just noise. And if you need to ignore that if you're going to overcome that obstacle and take action. Another source of cynicism is the people around you a lot of the time. People who'll say things like, oh, I bought a property once and it was nothing but hassle and I had to go and fix things all the time. That's just a limited way of thinking about it. And people saying things like, oh, well, if property investing is such a great idea, why isn't everyone doing it? You get all this cynicism around you, and it's really hard but really important to overcome that and take action in spite of all these things.
Absolutely agree. And I love the cynicism one. The best one is when people who start giving you really solid advice saying, oh, you shouldn't invest in property at the moment, it's the wrong time. And then you realise that they've never invested in property in their lives. It's like they've elevated themselves to expert status and they've never done it. It's like me trying to educate Steven Gerrard on football. It's just like crazy. Anyway, that one kills me, and I'm sure we all know someone like that. You know, everyone who's listening has met that person. So ignore them is the key. So how to take action? What should you do? Well, the first one, and we've mentioned this throughout, and it's not the first time you've heard it in a podcast, but it's educate yourself. You already are. You're listening to this. You should feel good about that. The fact you are doing not the normal thing by taking time out of your week to learn more about property investment. You should congratulate yourself because you are doing something that isn't normal. You're trying to learn and better yourself. The more you know about anything, but let's relate this to property investment, the more you know about property investment, the easier it is to get started. I know it sounds really simple and obvious, but it's true. When people come to me at RMP Property, I don't suddenly get the cash flows out and start looking at deals. Far from it. That takes weeks. We actually go through the education, make sure people understand their plan, make sure they get all their questions answered. And for some people, it's a little slow, and that's fine. We're probably not the right company. But for most people, they appreciate it because they'll know so much more by the time they get to invest that they'll feel empowered, and the nervousness for the vast majority of people will have disappeared because they've taken the time to educate themselves. Value the information. Get advice from advisors. So, I've mentioned RMP, but Rob's really accessible. Rob is fantastic at getting back to you if you ever have any questions. I'm also open to do it. Whether you're working with my company or not, I will always answer your questions. And there's plenty of people out there who will tell you that. I'm always happy to help. But there's not just me and Rob. There's forums. We've listed them before about how to educate yourself in property. So go back through the podcasts and look at using social media to invest in property. That's a really good one because we list of experts there that you should listen to. And I'm sure the majority would be more than happy to help. And finally, identify opportunities. When you're taking action, go for below market value if possible. It's what you want to be trying to achieve. But at the very least, look for the fundamentals. So go back to episode 6, the property podcast episode 6 for more information on that. But you as a minimum want the fundamentals, but hopefully you're going to achieve below market value as well.
So bringing all this together, I think we've said a lot of the times through talking about this, we've talked about this before. And the reason for that is because we've both read this book and taken it on board so much that we've kind of internalized a lot of it, and it feeds into a load of the other things we talk about. If a lot of this is sounding familiar, that's why. But even if you've listened to this podcast and you know all this stuff, if you haven't read the book, I really would recommend reading the book, because for something so simple, it is a really important reminder, and just kind of seeing it in the form of this really simple story, it might help you take this stuff that you intellectually know that this stuff is true, but it might help you to really internalize that and start taking action based on it. So there's nothing revelatory here, but if you just do some of these things that we've talked about in terms of paying yourself first, taking action, overcoming obstacles, you're going to find yourself in a very different position in a few years' time than if you hadn't done any of it at all. So really, really would recommend it.
So I can't credit who came up with this. I'll pretend it's my own, but it isn't. Rich Dad Poor Dad is advanced common sense. Okay, it's advanced common sense principles. You read that whole book, 95% of it you will already understand. But sometimes it just needs to be laid in front of you in a really simple way to digest for you to really let the lessons hit home. And that's what Rich Dad Poor Dad does so effectively. It lays out all the things you really already knew, but allows you to digest them really simply and therefore motivates you to take action. So please go and buy the book.
And we will link to it, of course. Okay, so let's get moving on then to our resource of the week. And we've got an iPhone special this week. I normally blame you for bringing up the iPhone resources and making Android users feel left out, but this time it's my fault. I've actually got 2 of them, so I'm doubling the problem. They're both about podcasts, and the first one was recommended to us by Guy Routledge, who came down to our meetup a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking to me about an app called Downcast. And this is a app for the iPhone that replaces the native podcast app, which is not very good. It's a far, far better one. The great thing about it is it downloads the show notes to your device as well, which means if you're listening to a podcast and they talk about something that's linked in the show notes, or there's something which is explained in more detail, you don't have to go over to your computer or go and search and find it. It's right there in the app. I think it costs $1.99, but if you're frustrated with your iPhone's podcasting app, you might want to give that a try. The other thing as well is called Swell. It's another podcast player for the iPhone. And this one is a bit different because it actually recommends podcasts to you based on your listening habits. So it sees what podcast you subscribe to. It sees which ones you listen to all the way through and which ones you skip and things like that. And based on that, it comes up with new recommendations for you. We recommend podcasts all the time. We recommend Meaningful Money a lot. We recommend the Lifestyle Business Podcast. I've recommended the Work Talk Show in this episode. That's a brilliant way of discovering new things. But if you want to get yourself out of the Rob and Rob echo chamber and find some things of your own, that could be a nice way of doing it. So that's Swell. So we're going to link to both of those in the show notes.
Don't leave us. I'd add one to that. I use an app called Instacast. Again, we'll link to it in the show notes. I use that on the iPhone instead of the native Apple app there. It's really good. So, but I'm definitely going to have a look at Downcast and Swell as well, because they sound real swell. Oh, sorry. I thought last week's puns were bad. Okay. So that's another episode wrapped up. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you realise the impact Rich Dad Poor Dad has had on ourselves and so many other people. And I hope you've learned some of the true lessons from it. There's a guide that accompanies all the things that we've done in this episode, which is in the RMP toolkit, which you can get for free. If you go to rmpproperty.com/property toolkit, you can get it there. You can, if you're already signed up to RMP Property, you can already access it through your toolkit that you have access to at any point. But we'll also link to that in the show notes. But next week, Rob, we've got a really good episode, one that people have requested for, and I think people are going to take a lot from it.
So next week, we're going to be talking about why you should invest away from home and how to do it. This is one that I've been talking to a lot of people about recently. If you're in an area that isn't ideal for property investment or doesn't meet your own personal criteria, we're going to talk about why you shouldn't see investing away from where you live as a barrier and some really practical strategies for doing it successfully. So I think it's going to be a really great episode.
It's going to be fantastic for 2 reasons, not just for the people in the UK who might be thinking of investing 50, 100, 200 miles away. I know there's a lot of expats who listen to this podcast as well. So the expats, this one is especially for you as well, because you can learn the lessons and the tactics to implement to make sure that wherever you are in the world, you can run your property. And of course, it's possible because look at Rob. He travels all over the place and runs his portfolio. And, you know, properties that I own are not on my doorstep either. So it's tactics that we employ ourselves every week.
Great stuff. Pleasure as ever, Rob.
Absolutely, Rob. See you next week, everyone. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.